Okay, we're back looking at the doctrine of sin, and if you haven't figured it out yet, you're supposed to stop sinning. Okay, good. Now we can move on to the other stuff in the lecture. Again, last time we looking at the natural law as a concept. Again, a very, very brief overview of the concept of natural law. But again, you can use this. There's lots of apologetics and philosophy of religion and theology we can do with this to argue for moral objectivism and the fact that there is a universally recognized moral law, which, by the way, in fact, everybody recognizes this. That's why we have world religions. That's why even atheists feel guilty and fear death, because they know that they violated God's law. And so now we're moving from natural law, which, again, very important, gives everyone notice of the Creator's expectations for their life, which, again, big objections, apologetic objections. If you had to have the top 5, one of them would be, what about the people who have never heard of Christ? Isn't it unfair? And what's significant, again, about that is that, okay, let's unpack it. There's lots of ways to answer that. Based on natural law and notice and things like that, I'd say, well, what does fairness have to do about it? The fact is that God gave everyone notice. People chose to violate the law, and not just once, constantly, and are unrepentant of it. So the fact is, God is completely fair, and in fact, he must give retributive justice, or that's when he's unfair, if he doesn't give people what's owed to them based on that. Then we'd say God was unjust because he didn't punish the wicked, or that he didn't reward us according to our good works. So since God can't be accused of being unfair or unjust, again, this is why what we have here is people have notice, which is sufficient, as Romans 1 said, for condemnation. They are without excuse. So now based on that, again, quick follow-up, well, guess what? How many people actually seek God? And we see, for example, in the book of Acts, we see Cornelius, the Gentile centurion. Here's somebody that's really interested. And then so we see this whole series of dreams where God's telling Cornelius, go here. God's telling Peter, hey, Peter, go eat Farmer John and not Hebrew National anymore. Go eat the pork chops. Go to the Gentiles. Why? So God is going to bring together someone who's going to tell them the truth for people who actually seek God. And we see that, based on texts like with Cornelius. But remember that it's not a fairness issue, is that, well, why doesn't God offer everyone a gift? Well, the same reason why you don't have to give everyone a gift, why you don't have to go and be friends with everyone in the world. Fact is, God has his moral and just reasons why everyone is not saved. But the fact is he's offering salvation to everyone. And whoever wants it, come and get it. So that's it. So, which is, again, more the reason why you need to study Bible, theology, the gospel, the law, and everything else, so you can go out and proclaim it and make a defense. So based on that, now let's move to the concept of the Mosaic law, or the law of God by special revelation. And I mean, all throughout the scriptures, it talks about Torah, it talks about the law of God. In the Gospel of John, we see, for example, it says, the law is given through Moses, grace and peace through Jesus Christ. Number of these kinds of statements that we see in the scriptures. But what's interesting about, again, the Mosaic law, and you'll see, views books on, how does the law apply to us today, especially the Mosaic law. And it's going to be everything from absolutely nothing to maybe the moral law of God in these certain ways. That's what applies to us. So let's go back and look at, when we talk about the Mosaic law, again, Torah, specifically that was given as guidance for the nation of Israel. Okay? So, and when we look at the types of laws, again, what's significant here is that classically there are 3 divisions of law, not because of some external superimposed standard, but it's because God says do these kinds of things. And, for example, here's how to run the nation. So category number 1 would be civil laws mentioned in the Old Testament, particularly in Torah. And civil laws prescribe the government, the judicial system, the penal code, how to do justice, and things like this. And so, again, a good case is just simply made that, look, we're not the nation of Israel, therefore the civil laws are abrogated. If you're not part of the nation of Israel, you're simply not under that. Okay, but that's one division, is how do you run the government? Should you have a king? How do you have a judicial council? What are the laws for, remuneration and contracts and things like that? So again, it's not an external superimposed standard, the concept of civil law. It's just law that relates to civil affairs. Which, by the way, too, if you talk about law in the state of California or whatever state you're in, guess what? They'll talk about criminal law, civil law, the government code, the evidence code, maritime law. Yeah, there might be one law, but it's subdivided into various subtopics about which various people owe a duty. The next would be the area of ceremonial law. And this is what the nation of Israel was supposed to follow. Ultimately, why? Because this gave us, again, a prescribed symbolic type of worship. And so this was everything from, the Passover, everything, drink offerings, and all of this. He said the law was a school teacher to lead us to Christ. Ultimately, ceremonial law symbolized, okay, very important, symbolized what Christ would do on the cross. That's why we see in the New Testament, they say the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin, but one sacrifice for sin forever, and he sat down at the right hand of God. So generally, Christians are going to agree, yeah, ceremonial law, gone. Why? Because Christ fulfilled the law. All the symbols that were in place in the Old Testament are fulfilled by Christ. But then we get to the area that's probably more debated among Christians today, and that is, what about the moral law of God? Now, forget the Mosaic law at this point, and think about this. The fact is, God says, be holy, for I am holy. Hence, I think we can make probably an almost irrefutable case that the moral law of God is eternal. Why? Because it's based on God's eternal attribute of holiness and righteousness, externally expressed. So any of those concepts, or primary concepts, very importantly, that are grounded in the divine nature itself expressed to us, they're simply immutable. So there is an immutable moral law of God. The question is, how much so would it be expressed in something like the Ten Commandments or the rest of the Torah? And again, you're going to get different Christian views on this. So for me personally, I can't see how you can get rid of the moral law of God. The fact is because we're commanded to be holy, and that never stops. So hence, we always have a commandment to follow the moral law of God. The question is, what is it? And what's expressed, and ultimately what, again, historically, a lot of Christians have followed, a lot of those look for this guidance for this, is the Ten Commandments. And while there's a lot to be said about the Ten Commandments as a basic statement about the moral law of God and following God, we see things like, for example, the first of the commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. Yeah, that's the first basic problem of the human race, is that we end up with something else that's ultimate in our life other than following the true and the living God. And guess what? That hasn't changed. And we keep going down the list of the Ten Commandments, which again are very important, that it's more than the express proposition here. Because, for example, let's look at you shall not murder. Yes, you shall not murder, but then Jesus explains, guess what? It's more than murdering. If you've hated your brother in your heart, you've committed murder. You're still in an act of sin. You're still in an act if you have malice in your heart towards someone. Because it's that malice in your heart that leads to malicious deliberations, which eventually leads to an overt act of committing murder. Same thing with selfishness and these other things. Covetousness, adultery, not being envious of other people's relationship, not respecting other boundaries for these other righteous relationships, which is a result of what? Your own selfishness. You don't care how it affects other people. You want it for yourself. So all of these, do not steal, do not covet, do not bear false witness against your neighbor. All of these are simply restated multiple times throughout the Scripture, and especially the New Testament, where we do get a bit of a disagreement on in the churches. Where is the Sabbath on this? And you're going to get different debates on, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Well, again, the idea of the Sabbath goes all the way back to Genesis 2. Remember, God rested on the seventh day from his work, from creation. So the concept of a Sabbath, 6 days work, 1 day rest, actually antedates the Mosaic law by a long, long time. And so this idea of work and rest as a pattern, work and then refocusing our spiritual life in communal worship and focus on the things of God has been important. But again, as we see, we'll focus on some of these in our discussions. But for example, Paul's statements on, don't let anyone judge you on what day you keep, whether it's a new moon, a Sabbath, or so forth. Yeah, so what if you're a first day Adventist or a seventh day Adventist or a third day Adventist, whatever day you keep to set aside, Paul says, don't let anyone judge you for what day you keep. Okay? Christians traditionally have a Sunday Sabbath because Christ rose on the first day of the week. So we have tended to follow that based on resurrection, based on we're, first day Adventist, so to speak. We're looking at the resurrection of Christ, the second coming of Christ. So the whole point is, should you keep a Sabbath? How so? And what are the rules for that? That's probably the more wobbly area. But the rest of the Ten Commandments are general principles. For example, go back to murder. Jesus says, but if you've hated your brother in your heart, you've committed murder. It's not just the unjust taking of another human life, okay, without justification. It's the fact that you start with malice. Well, guess what? In law, for example, and in morality, there are all sorts of malice sins as well as malice crimes. Say, rape, robbery, arson, all these things where you have a man-hating or a man-endangering state of mind. You don't have to commit the ultimate crime and kill someone. Again, rape, robbery, murder, all these things are the result of malice. So guess what? As God says, be angry and do not sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. And we're told also, don't let it go into malice and bitterness, because that's actually what ends up in the wrong overt act. Pharisees were great at making sure they didn't go into the wrong overt acts, but they were complete wrecks on the inside. Jesus called them, pearly white coffins with rotting corpses on the inside. Why? Because they were full of envy and strife and malice and hatred and all these things, even though they learned how to conform externally. So again, learn to do these things properly. Now, in the next segment, I'm going to look at a few other aspects of the law of God, what the Bible says about the law of God. But one of the things that's clear is that the moral law has not been abrogated. And we'll cover that in the next time. Thanks.